Big Séance Podcast, Episode 32. Welcome to the Big Séance Podcast. I'm Patrick Keller of BigSeance.com, and this is a place for an open discussion on all things paranormal, but specifically topics like ghosts and hauntings, paranormal research, spirit communication, psychics and mediums, and life after death. So basically, anything that pops up in my paranormal world. The candles are already lit, so you might as well come on in and join the seance. Welcome back. I want to thank you for once again visiting me here in the parlor today. I know you're probably very busy, so just relax today because it's story time once again. In this episode, the mysterious story of Pearl Curran and Patience Worth, the winner of the Love Never Dies book giveaway, and an update on the interesting experiences during my interview with a man involved in the early investigations of the actual events that inspired the Conjuring story. But first, she has popped up a few times in conversation here on the podcast. If you listened to my interview on Missouri history and hauntings with Ginger Collins Justice from December 11th, 2014, one of the stories we hit on was the story of Pearl Curran and Patience Worth. And I can't help thinking about Patience every time I talk to one of our favorite guests, Karen A. Dahlman, about her work with the Ouija. If you're just learning about Patience Worth, let me introduce you to the story, and then you'll see why it captivates me. Here's a portion of an article titled Ghostwriter and Ghost, The Strange Case of Pearl Curran and Patience Worth, written by Ed Simon. Many moons ago I lived. Again I come. Patience Worth my name. Wait, I would speak with thee. If thou shalt live, then shall I. Good friends, let us be merry. On July 8th, 1913, after months of experimentation, a St. Louis housewife named Pearl Curran finally had a breakthrough with her Ouija board. From this initial correspondence, Pearl Curran wrote, or depending on your perspective, transcribed, millions of words she attributed to a 17th century poet who called herself Patience Worth. Historical novels, religious tracts, and lyric poems were published and embraced by mainstream scholars as authentic examples of early American literature mediated from beyond the grave. The figure of Patience Worth was commended as an exemplary writer by organizations such as the Joint Committee of Literary Arts of New York. She was included in journals alongside such future canonical authors as Edna St. Vincent Millay, and she appeared in collections such as the Anthology of Magazine Writing and the Yearbook of American Poetry. All the more amazingly, readers and critics agreed that this was new work by a woman who claimed to have been dead for more than 2.5 centuries. These writings were either authentic documents that provided astounding evidence of humanity's survival after death, or an intricate and impressive hoax that hoodwinked scholars, critics, and editors. There is also another possibility that these works were the improvisational literary productions of a prodigy who believed herself to be a conduit of some muse from the hereafter. Questions of authorship and intention aside, what remains are the books, plays, and poems, once popular literature and now forgotten. Curran's output prompts us to ask some fundamental questions about history, genre, intention, effect, authorship, and why we choose to read what we read. Furthermore, her writings are a fascinating curio of an era in American literary history when academics and quacks, the rational and the occult, scholarship and magic all mingled together in popular discourse. Pearl Curran was born in 1883, towards the end of a century that saw the national landscape and the United States' position in the world radically altered. She and her audience were inheritors of the sometimes bizarre religious diversity of the American 19th century. It was a century that began with the religious anarchism of the Second Great Awakening, was defined by an apocalyptic civil war, and which moved into the bourgeois and respectable spiritualism of the late Victorian era. Occult experimentation was embraced by leading thinkers and writers, like William James, who with other leading scientists founded the American Society for Psychical Research. Curran was enmeshed in a culture of esoterica that she would have encountered during a Victorian adolescence. And the figure of Patience Worth revealed herself at a perfect time, just as the rising international power that was the United States began to critically reevaluate its 17th century Puritan origins. Colonial American writings were long dismissed as embarrassing anti-intellectual relics by great 19th century authors like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Nathaniel Hawthorne. In the early years of the 20th century, however, scholars began re-evaluating the 17th century canon. Pearl Curran supplied a perfect model in her creation of Patience Worth, who was included alongside actual poets as an example of colonial American artistic genius. As the United States began to assert itself on a global stage, it looked back towards its then agreed upon New England origins and began to refine its creation myth, extolling the virtues of Puritan thrift, industriousness, and individuality. Importantly for Curran, the colonial period was also one where women's voices were surprisingly not ignored. In early American poetry, the 17th century poet Anne Bradstreet, born 1612, died 1672, dominates as the single most exemplary and important literary figure. Other women writers like Mary Rowlandson, born 1637, died 1711, were the Puritan equivalents of bestsellers. This newfound enthusiasm for colonial American letters arrived at a perfect time for Curran. Indeed, the relative respect that colonial women writers like Bradstreet received dovetailed well with the feminine realm that was the early 20th century Séance. As Gioia de Liberto makes clear in her excellent introduction to the Patience Worth phenomena, Patience Worth, author from the great beyond, soon scores of self-anointed mediums burst on the scene, most of them women, whose passivity and purity, it was believed, made them ideal vessels to receive news from the other side. It's possible to view Curran as a native literary genius who, unable to promote her own authentic voice, is forced to invent a fictional persona that operates as her literary mask. Indeed, this is often how the case of Patience Worth is read. It's not without precedent. From the Fox sisters of upstate New York to Madame Blavatsky, the Séance has often been a woman's game, able to supply a distinctly feminine voice when the larger society would not otherwise listen. It is certainly possible to see Patience Worth in these terms, but it's limiting to exclude other possible interpretations of this strange corpus. Curran cannot be seen as just another literary-minded medium. Her case was different. Mediums like Blavatsky strongly delineated between their own writings and the short passages attributed to spirits. Curran, however, produced an incredible number of writings, all of which were attributed to Patience Worth. There are scores of poems, letters, and novels including Telka, The Sorry Tale, Hope Trueblood, The Pot Upon the Wheel, Samuel Wheaton, and Elizabethan Mask, among other works. How should one consider the sheer amount and breadth of such works? If a hoax, it is still a hoax that is anything but simple or easy. Although we do not need to explain such a prolific career framed in such a bizarre manner by suggesting that Patience Worth was a real person, there exists the possibility that Curran understood authorship in a more unconventional way than the wider culture frequently does. Between the possibilities of Patience Worth's reality and Pearl Curran's duplicity, there exists a third option, that Pearl Curran transcribed these works believing Patience Worth to be real, a creation of her own mind communicating these words back to her, an internal muse, if you will, whose existence serves to reevaluate the simple individual models of authorship we conventionally hold to. As such, her corpus provides an occasion for thinking about where inspiration comes from, how authors generate their writings, and the ways in which something as seemingly well understood as writing still contains a kernel of mystery at its core. Outside of occult circles, the embarrassing metaphysical nature of Patience Worth has relegated her to complete obscurity in the academic world for a century. There is not much respectability in the academic study of something that seems to be a hoax. This is an unfair fate for writings that, though not as technically proficient as works deemed canonical, still deserve study and attention, not just because of the way they illuminate an unusual period of American literary history, but also because the writings themselves are arguably more aesthetically proficient than one might expect. The critics who extolled the quality of Worth/Curran had their reasons for doing so, some of which still hold up. It should be emphasized again that these are not just short lyric poems that one could see a Ouija-using author writing in a few minutes. The sheer length of some of her books is astounding in itself, to say nothing of their literary quality. One need only flip through The Pot Upon the Wheel, a verse play whose dialogue sometimes reminds one of the spiritual urgency of a classical religious text like the Bhagavad Gita. Or take A Sorry Tale, a more than 600-page esoteric account of the life of Christ that at points reaches a prophetic pitch, calling to mind the theology of William Blake. Thankfully, this critical blind spot is beginning to be rectified with scholarly books like Daniel Shea's The Patience of Pearl, Spiritualism and Authorship in the Writings of Pearl Curran, published in 2012, and the aforementioned Diliberto article in 2010. They provide an excellent overview on the particulars of the Patience Worth case, analyzing not just biography, but also the context that produced these writings, and their reception and their loss. When dipping into the voluminous corpus of writings, one of the first things you notice is that they don't bear the haphazard stream of consciousness style so common in the automatic writing practiced by Dadaist poets and other avant-garde groups. But they also don't read like 17th century American prose and poetry, despite what early critical advocates of Pearl Curran like Caspar Yost may have claimed. At most, one could say that the works exhibit qualities of pastiche in their depiction of how American Puritans wrote and talked, though none of this should diminish the very real personality that seems to come through communications of Patience Worth. She appears as variously smart, pious, sentimental, feisty, and sarcastic. She doesn't read as a mere echo of Curran herself. As artistic creation, the idea of Patience Worth rather than her words are what is central. In reading her verse, one encounters a persona that while three-dimensionally vibrant, doesn't seem to match our expectations of how a 17th century New England woman would write. While syntax and phrasing can seem largely authentic, there is little of the orthodox Calvinism one finds in actual early American poets like Bradstreet, Edward Taylor, or Michael Wigglesworth. Rather, she seems to offer a broadly spiritual, New Age philosophy in keeping with the circumstances of her discovery. Later in this article, the author writes, "The Patience Worth case complicates questions of authorship. While it seems clear that Curran is the literal author, the fictionality surrounding the very productions of authorship helps to complicate our conceptions of creation and interpretation. Since the French philosopher Roland Barthes' 1967 essay, The Death of the Author, both formalists and historicists have become increasingly comfortable with the idea that authorship itself is a sort of fiction. Patience Worth / Pearl Curran makes this fictionality all the more obvious. As such, it seems that she is more than overdue for a critical rediscovery. In the long view of cultural history, her place becomes even more interesting. Biography and history become compressed, and the relationship between who is a real person and who is a fictional person becomes more ontologically uncertain. I'm going to break any sort of pose of objectivity and say emphatically that I do not believe that Patience Worth was anything more than a full-bodied creation of Pearl Curran." And this again is the author from the article. It's worth pointing out that there are no records of any actual Patience Worth having lived either in New England or Dorsetshire, where Curran claimed the poet was born. Yet imagine someone reading Curran a millennium from now. Would such distinctions as whether Worth is real or not matter to this imagined reader? For classicists, there are arguments about the reality of an author named Homer, ones that scholars working on much later periods don't have to consider in the same way. Philosophically, if a heteronym's words seem as full and real as an actual person, why can't they be treated as such? The fullness of the fictionality of Patience Worth is that it is a fictionality which imposes itself on the real world, and that in itself is a fascinating act of literary creation. This article by Ed Simon can be found at Public Domain Review&nbsp, a project of the Open Knowledge Foundation. A 2013 article from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, written by Jane Henderson and shared by permission, fills us in on a strange twist to this story in a section of the article titled "Two Moms and a Baby." For 21st century readers who are interested in neither the paranormal nor Worth's poetry, the Patience/Pearl story has yet another outrageous element. In 1916, Patience Worth decided that Pearl and John Curran should adopt a baby and that she, the spirit, would be its godmother. She urged the Currans to find a baby in need, and the story went that a poor, pregnant widow agreed to give up her infant. One gossip, however, later claimed that John Curran's daughter, 16, gave birth in secret. Known as the Ouija board baby and Patience Wee, a photo of the lass in a Puritan bonnet and ruby cross was published in 1917. Patience had ordered that the baby be spinster prim, though Shea says no Puritan would have worn a cross, let alone a ruby one. A St. Louis newspaper reported in 1917 that Patience Wee was given many presents, including a shawl from the Orient and a French war orphan, whose care was paid for 2 years in Patience Wee's name. The story noted that Patience Worth wrote verses for the tot, and no real flesh and blood mother could express more devoted sentiments. Yet another curious addition to the family appeared 6 months after John Curran died in 1922. After years of childlessness, and with Curran on his deathbed, Pearl conceived at age 39. Shea, through close reading of the Patience Worth records, indicates that the real father of the baby, Eileen, may have been a prominent lawyer, John Cashman. Sisters Patience Wee and young Eileen would end up moving to California with Pearl, who would marry twice more. Their lives didn't necessarily calm down. While Curran's fame had diminished, she still talked to her spirit for the likes of Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford. Eventually, Eileen became a caretaker for Patience Wee, now called Patty, and Patty's husband. Both apparently were alcoholics, and Patty was found dead at age 27 after drinking and taking sleeping pills. Curran died in 1937 at age 54. Obituaries said she never became wealthy, despite Patience Worth's fame. She was not the best or last poet to channel spirits. Others included William Butler Yeats, Sylvia Plath, and James Merrill. But unlike those respected poets, the Patience/Pearl case is unique in that the invisible spirit, rather than the earthly writer, remains the literary star. Links to both of these articles can be found in the show notes at bigseance.com. If you can't tell, Patience Worth is my current fascination, and I am currently reading the book mentioned in the first and second article, both actually, The Patience of Pearl, Spiritualism and Authorship in the Writings of Pearl Curran by Daniel B. Shea. Although I have to admit it's not an easy read. It's very academic, and so I'm taking my time getting through this one. After a random drawing of all participants in the Big Séance Love Never Dies book giveaway, I am excited to announce that Rebecca Codner is the winner and will soon receive her own copy of the book, courtesy of the author and Hay House Publishing. Here's the story Rebecca submitted for her entry. We lived over my father-in-law's gas station from August 1982 to December 1989 in Syracuse, Ohio, and I had many dreams of an uncle of mine who had crossed over in 1980 while living there. The dreams would happen after 4 a.m. In my dreams, he would stop by to see how I was doing, and when I would tell him I was okay, he would walk on through the living room and then continue on his way out towards the kitchen. He always wore work boots, and at times you could actually hear someone with work boots walk through the house, be it day or night, and when you'd check to see who it was, no one would be there. I had dreams of this uncle many times while living there, and even after I moved to California. I think he was just making sure things were okay, and he was looking out for me. The first dream I did have of him, though, he called me on the phone and wanted me to give my aunt a message, letting her know that he was okay and for her not to worry. I told him I would pass on the message to her, and I was sure she'd be glad to hear this. We talked a little more in my dream, and after a little while, I woke up, and when I did, I thought my aunt was going to think I was crazy when I told her I had a dream about Tom, and that he had given me a message to give her. The dream wouldn't leave my mind, and I didn't realize this was going to happen, but my aunt stopped by my home the same day I had the dream. I proceeded to tell her about my dream and the message from Tom, and she never thought anything of it. She said that she was glad he was okay. My aunt never thought I was crazy with my dream either. In fact, on her way to my place, she went by a bar my uncle would go to once in a while, and she said when she did, she thought of him. This incident happened in either 1986 or 1987. And finally, before I leave you today, I want to update you on a comment I made recently on Facebook and Twitter. It was my original plan to release an interview that I had with Keith Johnson today. Keith is a demonologist and paranormal investigator, and was one of the very first investigators on the scene at the actual house that has now been made famous in the movie The Conjuring. The interview, which was recorded last week, seemed to be cursed from the beginning with technical issues, which began with a Skype connection, which is how I record most of my interviews. The connection issues actually continued after we decided to continue our conversation over the phone, which in this day and age seemed very strange to me. Many important chunks of the story in the interview were dropped due to these issues. Keith says that this often happens when he talks about this story. He is such a nice man and has a lot of knowledge and experience from this story, and he was very patient with all the techie issues. As interesting as these issues were, I feel like I need to connect with Mr. Johnson again soon and capture the parts of the story I missed or didn't capture so clearly. And when I do, I'll piece together an interview that is sure to gain your complete attention. So stay tuned. Well, it has been kind of a different episode today. I hope you'll let me know your thoughts, especially if they have to do with Patience Worth. And please consider sharing this episode, or a favorite episode with a fellow paranerd, or maybe even visiting iTunes to rate or review the show. It really helps me out and gets the word out to people who might just enjoy listening to something like the Big Séance podcast. See you back here soon. For show notes, including links to anything we may have mentioned in this episode, visit bigseance.com, now the home of both the blog and the podcast. Just click on the Big Séance podcast logo or find it in the menu. You can also find and subscribe to the show on iTunes and Stitcher. Do you have any comments or feedback? Please contact me at patrick@bigseance.com. You can call my feedback line at 7755-TELL-ME. That's 775-583-5563. You can also record audio feedback right from the site using the SpeakPipe link included in the show notes. I could decide to include your voice in a future show. Thank you so much for listening and reading. Unfortunately, it's time to blow the candles out, but we'll see you and light them again next time.